Hi friends, I'm here again on this YouTube channel EngLITZone with a new video of English literature. Yes friends, today we will discuss metaphysical poetry, and in this video we will cover the topics of the definition of metaphysical poetry, elements and also important poems of this metaphysical poetry. And before discussing more about what is metaphysical poetry, first we should know the term metaphysical is coined by Dr. Johnson, and John Donne was the most prominent figure of this metaphysical school of poetry because his poetry are replete with the characteristics which are required for metaphysical poetry like aphorism, like concise metaphor, and also platonic love. These are some characteristics of the metaphysical poetry, and John Donne had all these qualities, all these writing style he had used in his composing his poetry. And friends, I want to tell you all that if you want to join me on WhatsApp and Telegram, here's the number 7838343836. This is the number of WhatsApp and Telegram. You can join me here, and we have a group here related to the English quiz. And please message me if you want to join. Let's move on to the topic metaphysical poetry. Friends, here first we will discuss what is metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical is a combination of two words, meta, which means beyond, and physique, which means physical nature. Metaphysical जो word है वो दो words के combination एक combination से बना हुआ है. The first is meta, जिसका मतलब होता है beyond. The second is physique, जिसका मतलब होता है physical nature. So the overall meaning of this metaphysical word is beyond physical nature. That is the important characteristic of metaphysical poetry. Moving on to the next, we have metaphysical poetry is that in which a poet remains away from the description of physical intimacy. Yes, friends, whatever poetry, whatever the composition you will see of the metaphysical poets, you will see that there is no things that relate to the physical intimacy or describe physical intimacy in the poet poetry of the metaphysical poetry. They talk about the platonic love that is called spiritual love. Spiritual love की बात metaphysical poets ने अपनी poetic composition में की है. They have not talked about any kind of physical intimacy between lover and beloved. That is the key point of the metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical is a philosophical concept used in literature to describe things that are beyond the description of physical existence. Yes, friends, this is a kind of concept, philosophical concept used by the metaphysical poets in the literature, in English literature, and in 18th century literature. And they describe the thing that is not existence, that is not in this world. They talked about universal thing, they talked about spiritual things in their poetry. That is the concept described by the metaphysical poetry, and that is the concept is called philosophical concept used by metaphysical poetry while composing their poems or poetic composition. Next we have literary critic and poet Samuel Johnson first coined the term metaphysical poetry in his books Lives of the Most Eminent English Poet, which was first published in 1779. Yes, friends, this is very important. Sometimes questions related to this also ask who coined the term metaphysical poetry. The answer is Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson was the literary critic and poet who coined this term metaphysical poetry in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English poets, which is also known as Lives of the Poet. इसका टाइटल सेकंड टाइटल ये भी है जो कि जाना जाता है इंग्लिश लिटरेचर में लाइव्स ऑफ द पोएट्स, जो कि फर्स्ट पब्लिश हुई है 1779 में. एंड इन दिस बुक, in this literary book, he had talked about, Johnson has talked about 52 poets of the 18th century. 52 poets के who lived in 18th century, जिन्होंने 18th century में जो थे, जो poets थे, वो 52 poets के शॉर्ट बायोग्राफी और क्रिटिकल अप्रेजल को उन्होंने अप्रिसिएट किया है, उनकी बायोग्राफीज को डिस्कस किया है अपनी इस बुक लाइव्स ऑफ द मोस्ट एमिनेंट इंग्लिश पोएट, which is also known as Lives of the Poet, and it was originally published in 1779. So this is very important line. Please friend note down this in your notes. Next, moving on to the next, we have Donne is generally considered the most prominent member of the metaphysical poets. Yes, friends, John Donne, regarded as the prominent and most important poet of this metaphysical school of poetry. His poetry are replete with the characteristics, replete with the concepts used in the metaphysical poetry. That's why he is regarded as the important figure, important poet of this metaphysical poetry. Next, we have Dryden had written of Donne in 1693. He affects the metaphysics. This is the line, this is the appreciation given by ड्राइडन टू जॉन डन जॉन ड्राइडन ने जॉन डन के बारे में लिखा है, कहा है 1693 में, he affects the metaphysics. That is the reason he was regarded as the founder or as the key figure or the representative poet of the metaphysical poetry. Dryden has written this about John Donne, that he affects the metaphysics. Next, we have here in Donne's love poems, he demonstrates his feelings and emotions by using precise and exact words, yet he has never praised any woman's physical beauty. Yes, friends, this is the characteristic of John Donne's poetry. That's why he is regarded as the representative poet or key poet of the metaphysical poetry. He he describes the beauty of women not through the physical intimacy or not their physical beauty. In his love poems, whatever love poems he has written as canonization, and we have another, the Plea, these are the poems in which he had talked about the spiritual love, that is called platonic love in metaphysical poetry. And also he has used the exact words and some very concise words used in his poetry to describe the beauty of women or in a lady in a spiritual way or in a platonic way in his poetry. Metaphysical poetry was a group of 17th century British poets that included John Donne, Richard Herbert, Richard Crossa, Andrew Marvell, Henry Vaughan, and Abraham Cowley. This is the group of the poet of the 17th century British poets, and that metaphysical poets are John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crossa, Andrew Marvell, Henry Vaughan, and Abraham Cowley. These are the important poets of the metaphysical poetry, and this metaphysical poetry is the group of the 17th century British poets. Yes, friends, this is important. They are all are British poets of the 17th century. Next, we have it also allows the writer to express their inner thoughts in the verses through higher cognitive skills that are required to understand the concept and abstract ideas presented in metaphysical texts. The poets, they use their thoughts in the verse, in the form of verse, by applying their higher cognitive skills. They have applied their higher skills, higher mindedness, and supreme mindedness to express their inner thoughts in their poetry. That's why these concepts, that's why this poetry, metaphysical poetry, is sometimes ambiguous. They had aphoristic style. They have some kinds of proverbs, maxims used by the poet. इस पोइट्री में, मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री में, कभी कभी ये एम्बिगुअस पोइट्री को बोला जाता है, बिकॉज दे आर नॉट वेरी इजी टू अंडरस्टैंड. वो बहुत आसानी से अंडरस्टैंड नहीं होते. अ पर्सन हु, reader who is reading or who is reciting the poem first time, that person is unable to understand the poetry of metaphysical poets, because they all have the higher cognitive skill used in their poetry to express their ideas, to express their inner feelings or emotions. That's why this poetry, metaphysical poetry, is very tough to understand for the first time readers. Now let's talk about the elements of the metaphysical poetry. Yes, friends, this poetry, metaphysical poetry, is free from artificiality. Yes, there is no kind of artificiality show off in the poetry of the metaphysical poets, because they all talked about the spiritual love, platonic love, or the things that is exact, that is real. They talked about that things in their poetry. Metaphysical poetry contains conceits and hyperboles. Yes, friends, the poets use the two types of the metaphors that is not very similar to comparison, but they have just opposite. They have compared such things which are just opposite from one another. That is called conceits, and hyperbole also used by the metaphysical poets. This poetry, metaphysical poetry, is intellectual, yes, friends, because poets had used their cognitive skill, their higher cognitive skill to express their inner thoughts or feelings. That's why this poetry is very much higher in intellectual. Metaphysical poetry always remains away from the female physique. Yes, there is nothing related to the physical love, physical intimacy talked about the poets in this poetry. All poets of the metaphysical poetry, they talked about the spiritual love or higher love. This poetry is about emotions and psychological experiences. Yes, friends, this poetry, the metaphysical poets, this is the element of metaphysical poetry, that this poetry has a psychological experiences of the poets that they describes in their poetry. Friends, now we will discuss about the some metaphysical poems. First, we have John Donne's poetry, The Good Marrow, The Sun Rising, The Anniversary, The Canonization, A Benediction Forbidding Morning, and The Nocturnal upon St. Lucia Day. These are the compositions of John Donne. Friends, later on in our next video or coming videos, we will discuss the poetry of metaphysical poets in details, and we will discuss each and every poems of this metaphysical poetry in details our next video. So please wait for that and enjoy the further videos which are going to be uploaded on EngLITzone channel. Next we have George Herbert, Jordan First, The Pearl, The Collar, The Discipline and Love Third. These are the poems of the George Herbert. Next we have Andrew Marvell, one of the important poet of metaphysical poetry. The Coronet, Bermudas, To His Choir Mistress. This is very important poem of the Andrew Marvell. The Definition of Love and the Garden. Next we have Henry Vaughan. He retreat the word man, and they are all gone into the world of light. These are the composition of Henry Vaughan. Now, friends, let's discuss metaphysical school of poets. Who were the poets who belongs to the metaphysical school of poetry and what kind of poetry they had written? We will discuss all that here in this section. We have the poets, important poets from this school of poetry: John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crossa, and also Abraham Cowley. These are the well-known poets from the school of metaphysical poetry or from the metaphysical movement. Yes, friends. So we will cover very important compositions by these poets and also their time duration in a very brief way so that we can easily understand what kind of poetry they had written. So, friends, these are the important poets of the metaphysical movement. The first we have John Donne from 1572 to 1631. This is the time duration of John Donne. George Herbert is on second poet, 1593 to 1633. Andrew Marvell, 1621 to 1678. Henry Vaughan, 1622 to 1695. Richard Crossa, 1612 to 1649. Abraham Cowley, 1618 to 1669. So, friends, these the poets from the school of metaphysical poetry, they all had some peculiar qualities, say quality of the metaphysics, and that's why their poetry are from away normal poetry like the Elizabethan poetry, or we talk about romantic poetry, and we talk about Victorian poetry. They have written some kinds of poetry which are very not easy to understand. That's why they had some kinds of far-fetched metaphors they had used. They had talked about platonic love, and also they have talked about conceits. They have included conceits in their poetry. That's why their poetry is regarded as one of the more difficult poetry in history of English literature, and that's why they are included, and they had written their poetry during this time, and that's why their poetry is known as the metaphysical poetry. Very first poet from the Metaphysical school of poetry we have John Donne, and John Donne is regarded as one of the most prominent figure of this movement, metaphysical uh, poetry, and he's sometimes considered as the founder of this school of poetry, which is known as metaphysical poetry. And yes, friends, do not forget that this word is derived. The word metaphysic is termed by or coined by Dr. Johnson. And John Donne had written his most of the works related to the poems. They are the poetry, the Flia, the dream we have, holy sonnets he had written, the sun rising composed poem, the canonization, one of the best poem of the metaphysical school or from John Donne, the good marrow, death be not proud, valediction for mid morning, and also Elegy 19 to his mistress going to bed. These are the important works, the important poetic words composed by John Donne, who was known as the founder of metaphysical poetry. Next, we have George Herbert. This is the time duration of George Herbert from 1593 to 1633, and this is the picture of George Herbert and one of the metaphysical poet. And we have the important collection of poetry from the George Herbert. We have the work known as the Temple, which was published in 1633, and in Temple he had subtitle. He has composes included many poems like Virtue, The Altar, The Pearl, The Collar, The Pulley, and Easter Wings. These are all are the poems included in his work The Temple. The Temple was a collection, and this work, this poetry was included in this Temple. It was published in 1633. And number three, we have Andrew Marvell. Andrew Marvell's time duration was from 1621 to 1673. This is the picture of Andrew Marvell. And the works, the poetic composition he had composed Bermudas, the Garden, the Coronet, the Mourner's Song to his choir mistress. This is one of the most important poem or most important composition of Andrew Marvell, and regarded as one of the best poem of English literature of the metaphysical school of poetry. And next we have the definition of love on Mr. Milton's Paradise Lost. This is also recognized composition of Andrew Marvell. The An Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland. And this is also the last one is also this one is also one of important work of or important composition of Andrew Marvell. Friends, we are only talking about the important compositions, not talking about any other works of these writers or these poets, because here we are only focusing on the compositions or poetic compositions which are belongs to the metaphysical poetry. That's why we have only included important composition of the important poets of this school of poetry. Four poet of this school of poetry, metaphysical movement, that is Henry Vaughan. His time duration was from 1622 to 1695. This is the picture of Henry Vaughan. And we have the works, we have the composition of the Henry Vaughan, the word, corruption, childhood, the retreat, the timber, retirement, the shower one, the world man, Christ nativity, a song to Amoret, love and discipline, and also I walked the other day. These are the important compositions from the pen of Henry Vaughan in related to the metaphysical poetry. We have next one is Richard Crossa, and this is the time duration of Richard Crossa. The 1612 to 1649, very less time duration he had. He had lived very less life, and he had written important works, important poetic composition in reference of metaphysical poetry, and epitaph upon husband and wife. But men love darkness rather than light. Another is Christ crucified. Next one is divine epigraph, to our Lord upon the water made wine. And another is divine epigram on the miracle of multiplied lovers, loaves. Next we have prayers, and next one is a hymn to the name and honor of the admirable Saint Teresa. And the last one is one on the water of our Lord's baptism. These are the important poetic composition from the pen of Richard Grossa. Here we are going to discuss the last poet of the this video, and who are very important from the school of metaphysical poetry, and that is Abraham Cale. His time duration is from 1618 to 1667, and his important works are Life, Beauty, The Wish, The Despair, Platonic Love. Yes, Platonic love was one of the important characteristics of metaphysical poetry, and he had written, composed a poem on that topic. The Given Heart, The Grasshopper, The Heartbreaking, Bathing in the River, The Tree of Knowledge, and the last one is included in this video, that is On the Death of Mr. Crossa. These are some important works from the pen of Abraham Cowley, and we had talked about important poets of this metaphysical poetry, metaphysical movement. Thank you very much for watching this.